Some of you in HR have hives after watching those videos for the last few weeks. Both of those could have been things that we wanted young people to know about. Number one, never go to an interview like that. And number two, that we're running Youth Alpha congruent to our services starting next weekend. We would love for you to sign up. If you hear us talk about all these things and wonder, how do I let them know that I'm going to come? We have an app. It's called the Church Center app. If you don't have it on your phone yet and you're here regularly, you really should have it on your phone because it's the easiest way for you to connect to the other things that we're doing outside of Sunday mornings, whether that's giving or whether that's events or whether that's groups that we're running. Everything kind of flows through that app. So if you don't have it yet, free permission to use your phone at some point when I get boring and download that app. This morning. It will help you sign up for those things. Youth Alpha starts next Sunday, and again, it'll run during service, so it's not an extra thing you have to come to. It's just a resource we're trying to offer some of our students between grades 7 and 12 over the next number of weeks. Ryan Waterman and a few others are going to lead that for us. The question that we've been asking over the last number of weeks has been this: have you ever been a part of a conversation that you weren't prepared for? I think that we probably all have, especially as it relates to our faith. What we're trying to do here right now over the last couple of weeks and finishing up this week is provide some straightforward responses to questions that often come up about our faith, because it's been my experience that lots of genuinely caring people I know about are not totally ready to address their faith. When somebody asks you the question, usually what we try and do is give them all the details. They ask us a question about our faith, and we try and take 15 minutes to rattle off everything that we can think about, with regards to our faith. And the problem is they don't want to give you 15 minutes. They want to give you 15 seconds. They often kind of answered or asked a question that you've heard before. And so, when you say, hey, I've got this book and it would be really helpful, usually they don't want to invest that much time in it. Or I have this podcast. If you just spend the next hour listening to this, it will explain what you need to know, but it doesn't fit into their timeline. Sometimes we ask those questions, and we get met with some level of hostility, right? Well, I went to this church this one time and they did this thing, or I had a friend who went here and they did this to them, and so I'm never going back to church again. Why should I care about church? Or your book that you read and you follow says that when children misbehave, we should stone them. So I'm not going to read your book because it's evil and it's wrong. And what happens to us is one of two things. Either we get ourselves off balance, or worse yet, we start to get argumentative, right? We take the bait. We fall into the trap. And I would suggest there's a better way. That's what I want to try and help with today. I want to try and help us do what Peter said we should be ready to do when he told his friends, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give a reason for the hope that you have. So in week 1 of this series, we talked about what that hope is, and that the hope has always been built on something that happened in history. That Jesus Christ came and he lived and he died and he rose again. And that action was connected to the action of God in our world. And so people went and they told the story of Jesus, who had come and lived and died and rose again. And even more incredibly, had predicted that all of that would happen and then pulled it off. And we looked at how our hope is grounded in this historical event that eyewitnesses have told about. And that our hope has reason because of that. Week 2, we talked about how sometimes we try to appeal to the Bible as the reason for our hope. And we discovered and we talked about and we explored how the Bible is challenging for us to go and appeal to because it's ancient and it's complicated. You know, like when we give people a Bible and they're like, great, I'll start reading it. And you're like, but don't start at the beginning, right? Like don't start there. You got to start in the middle. Well, what kind of book do you start in the middle? Do you guys remember Choose Your Own Adventure books from when you were a kid? It's not a Choose Your Own Adventure book. Why would I start in the middle of the book? You know, and what we talked about was how it's not just because we have a book, because we have a holy book, but because the holy book is filled with eyewitness accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, James, and Paul all met Jesus, saw Jesus, and testified to Jesus. So what's more compelling when somebody asks you why you value the Bible, right? Well, I believe that Jesus died and rose again, okay? I don't believe that just because a book says so. I believe that because actual people, verifiable, historical individuals gave testimony to what Jesus did. And today, I want to tackle the third thing that I think we often encounter or often appeal to, which is that, you know, I believe in Jesus because of my personal experience. And how that's powerful, but there's something even better than that, right? Because here's the challenge with personal experience. For every person that's had a positive personal experience, you can find somebody who's had a negative experience. You can have somebody whose story is the flip side of the positive, right? Because we live in a world that has pain and suffering. The problem of pain is the third big thing. You know, why do you believe in Jesus at all? What's with the Bible? And if God is so good, why is there pain and suffering? And I want to be really clear. Everything that I'm about to say, let's quantify who this is for, okay? This is not a message for you today if you're going through a difficult season, okay? I am also not giving you advice on how you talk to somebody who's going through a difficult season, okay? This is not where we start those conversations. This is a conversation about how we have a conversation with somebody who is playing the role of antagonist, okay? Someone who's hiding behind that one-liner, well, if there's a good God, why is there so much suffering in the world, okay? Because their thinking goes like this, right? So we understand who this is for and who it's not for, right? I do not want you to give, if you have a friend who comes to you and they're having a hard time and they're in tears and they ask you, like, why am I going through this? I do not want you to start with what I'm about to tell you, okay? It's not nearly empathetic enough for that moment, okay? So just be really, really clear, okay? But if somebody comes to you and they kind of slide you that one-liner as though you're not ready for it, I want you to be ready for the one-liner. Okay, this is how their thinking goes. If God is good, well, then he would eliminate evil, right? If God's all powerful, he can eliminate evil. So, because there's evil and suffering and pain in the world, is God unwilling or unable to remove it from the world? That's how the thinking goes. And I would suggest to you that there are two responses. One is very quick, and one takes more time. So the very quick one is to ask them, hey, have you done any previous work or research on this topic before? Stop. Right? The answer is often no. And what you can then say is, well, there's tons of material exploring this option. I would suggest that you go and read it. Now, I just told you that they're not going to do this. But you could say this. Okay? Why? Because what you're trying to communicate in that moment is, I'm actually not stumped by this question. This is not a new question. This is not a question that people haven't already, spent a lot of time and put a lot of effort into coming up with answers for. So we, Christians, are not stumped by the problem of evil. The Bible, in fact, gives us an answer to why evil exists. And that's what we're going to explore. So we are not stumped by the problem of pain and suffering. The second way that you could answer them is that awesome Socratic method of answering a question with a question. Okay, let me ask you something. If you could, would you remove everything bad from the world right now? If you had the power to do that, let's assume you have a button. Okay? If you push the button, you can remove everything bad from the world in an instant. Would you push it? Nah, hang on. Before you answer. Have your kids ever done anything bad? Did your dad ever do anything bad before he met your mom? Have you ever done anything bad? Okay? Is it a quick answer? It's not. The only way for God to remove all of our complaints about pain and suffering from the world is to remove all the complainers. Right? And you all hesitated because you know that phrased the way I phrased it, you'd have to remove somebody that you care about. And if you have a reason to hesitate, has it ever occurred to you that God has a reason to hesitate? Christians believe that God's good reason for hesitating is you and me. This is what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Okay? The promise of what? The promise of Jesus returning. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. It isn't a factor of will or effort that has slowed Jesus coming back, right? Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Let me ask you again, if you have a good reason to pause, is it possible God has a good reason to pause too? The problem is, the problem that we don't want to admit is that God has a good reason to pause, and we have a good reason to pause. Because we hold God to a different standard than we hold ourselves, we make ourselves hypocrites. We want to hold God to a standard that we are not willing to be held to. What do I mean? Think about it this way, right? So what we're saying here is that it's okay for God to allow pain and suffering to exist because of us, because of how we process pain and suffering. Because we don't experience pain and suffering the same way universally every time pain and suffering happens, right? In other words, we don't have a problem with pain and suffering until it affects us or somebody we care deeply about. Think about what happens when somebody tells you about their pain and suffering. What happens? The most empathetic of us do not experience that pain and suffering the same way the person going through it is experiencing pain and suffering, right? We say, oh, so terrible, I'll pray for you. It's funny, when pain and suffering happens to us, we have a tendency to get less religious, but when it happens to somebody else, we have a tendency to get more religious. Do you ever notice that? Right? I'll pray for you. We only find suffering problematic when it happens to us. We endure other people's suffering all the time. So why can't God endure people suffering for a good reason. Right? What we want is the ability to, we want something to fix problems for us. I've got 2 cans here. What we want, this is my can of justice. Okay? What we want is by our own standard to be able to administer justice when we feel like it. Los Angeles Dodgers. The right wing. The left wing. It smells good up here. Can anybody else smell it? No, you can't. You're not close enough to my sense of justice. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Right? We want to hold the justice can. We also, for effect, I'm going to put the microphone down for a second. Probably the one moment in which I wish I had a headphone mic. We also want this can of bad, right? You know? Like we want to get rid of people who do bad things, like that guy who's had a noise curfew violation for the last 5 years in a row on New Year's Eve. Right? Dudes who drive enormous trucks very fast in very bad weather. Sometimes I call them truckles. That's a pretty one for you. That might be over the line, I apologize. Sometimes I get carried away. What did you say, Gordon? The Vancouver Ducks! I'm a Leafs fan. I know. I'm sorry. What's that? Here's my point. You don't have my cans. You don't get to decide. I want to be in charge. Right? We all want that, don't we? Right? We all want to be able to decide as long as we can hold the cans. Right? As long as we can hold the cans. Because when you're holding the cans, guess what? You can't get sprayed. Right? So, have you ever done something unjust? Have you ever done something bad? Why do you get exempted? Why do we exempt ourselves from what we know is standard justice, right? We don't want to give up the cans because if somebody else has the cans, they might spray us, right? All the Canucks fans in the room are now ready to charge the stage and spray me because I'm not one of you, right? And you, the Toronto Maple Leafs, are part of the axis of evil too, right? Okay, I'm being silly with it, but just think about it for a quick second. The worst person in the universe to hold the cans is God. Because he has the right to spray everybody. And he might decide that compared to his standard, we're all unjust. And we're all bad enough. Right? I had a conversation with somebody yesterday about the idea of bad. You know, like, I actually find sometimes we use this language in a difficult way because most of us are not what I would consider bad. Most of the people in the world are not what, from my standard, I would consider bad. That's the problem. My standard isn't enough. My standard isn't God's standard. My standard is lower than his. So if he has the cans and he gets to make the decision and he can push the button or he can spray the can whenever he wants, we're all in big trouble. Right? All of this points to 2 widely held assumptions that I think should transform the way we think. Certain things, this is the first thing, we have some, not universal, but widely held assumptions about good, bad, and justice. The first thing that we all assume is that some things ought not to be, right? You don't have to look very far to find something that I hope everybody in this room can agree that murder is bad, right? Everybody? Don't raise your hand. We have a word for people that don't think that that's bad, and it's not a kind word. I'm not going to use it. Okay. We all agree, right? I hope all of us agree. Most people in society agree that if somebody's married, it's not a good idea to steal their spouse. Right? Like, we get that. We have, home wreckers. We have words for things like that, right? Generally speaking, there are some things that tick morality, and they do it across human societies, right? Like, there are some things that we just understand ought not to be about this world. This problem, this conversation is what turned C.S. Lewis from an atheist to one of the world's most famous and enduring theologians. Right? Because C.S. Lewis realized something. Justice and our sense of good and evil is either something I make up, okay, or not. And because so much is agreed upon by so many people as to what is good and evil, that when people step outside of these ideas, right? Like when people step outside of the idea that human life is worth preserving, we begin to talk about them being mentally unwell. Because of that, either I made it up or the evidence suggests it came from somewhere. Where did it come from? Where did the common sense of good and evil come from? C.S. Lewis was tortured by this idea, and it drove him to find God, right? And furthermore, all of our complaints about God, here's the problem. Try and follow this circular logic for a quick second. If there's no moral standard, in other words, if there's no being that created a sense of morality and implanted it in humanity, we cannot hold anyone or anything to our moral standard because it's completely subjective. That includes God. Isn't that problematic? If you buy into the idea that common morality came from somewhere, right? You can't apply your morality to that common morality against the being that created it. This is a problem. This is how C.S. Lewis wrote about it. Quarreling means trying to show that another person is wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Suppose for a second that you hear a cry for help from a man in danger. You will probably feel two desires. One desire would be to give help, right? Due to your helping instinct. It's embedded in all of us. The other, a desire to keep ourselves from danger. That is the instinct for self-preservation, which we all have. But you will also find inside of you a third impulse, which tells you that you ought to follow the first impulse and suppress the impulse to run away. The question that drove C.S. to changing his opinion about God was, where did that impulse come from? Because it seems to rest in almost all of us. That's the first thing that this conversation should drive us to consider. We believe the world is not how it ought to be. Why do we believe that? The second thing that's widely accepted is that this world is broken. Not just us, but in truth, the world itself. We ask big questions when big events of nature happen and lots of people die. We understand, like, why is it like that? Right? And Christians believe that that's true, that the world is broken, fundamentally broken. We also believe that this isn't the final version of this world that we live in. Right now, we are just on the best path toward the best world that we can imagine. The best world is the one in which humanity falls in love with Jesus and out of its free will chooses to stop sinning. What does that look like? Many of us have had children or have children. And so you know that when your children are small, you have to teach them not to touch the hot stove, right? You try everything in your power to stop them from putting their little hands on the thing that you know is dangerous. In my house, we failed. Many houses have failed at trying to warn your kids against touching the stove when it's hot, right? You know what's interesting about that? You only have to let them touch the stove once. They'll never do it again once they understand how hot the stove is, okay? So it is possible for temptation to exist and us to choose not to give in to it. Paul writes about this in Romans chapter 8. This is 18 to 21. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. What we're going through right now is temporary. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. Read that again. Creation waits in eager anticipation for the children of God to be revealed. In other words, the healing of humanity is directly tied to the healing of our physical planet. So if you don't like hurricanes, stop sinning. The creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. In other words, by the will of God, creation has been subjected to the frustration that creates the problems in it. Okay? Why? In hope that the creation will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. In other words, creation is waiting for us. When the day comes that Jesus returns and we see him in all his glory, we will choose freely to love and obey him. And when we do that, the world will find healing, not just us. The truth is, not everything in me is right. Not everything in you is right. Not everything in our world is right. And something better is coming. This is what we hope for. Jesus pointed to a day where everything will be as it ought to be when he comes to reign with his people again. We, in the meantime, have knowledge of good and evil. And so we must manage the tension of knowing things are not right while we resist evil and injustice in us and around us, because our consciences are informed by something outside of us They're informed by the one who created us, God who put his image on and in us. As we do, we look forward to a better world where our knowledge of the consequences of sin drive us to the logical response. I am going to stop hurting myself, the people I love, and everybody else. I choose to leave my life of sin to follow Jesus. If God removed every evil from the world, he would have to begin with you and me. But I believe God entered this world through his Son to forgive me rather than remove me. I believe he died for my sin and rose from the dead, and now I'm a part of his plan to heal the world. I believe this is reasonable because Jesus Christ, by some power of God, predicted his own death and resurrection, and then he pulled it off. And how do I know that? Because hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people saw, and some of them wrote it down. Matthew, Mark, the friend of Peter, Luke, the doctor, John, the apostle, Paul, the murderer turned zealot, James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. And those documents, those witness accounts are freely available for you and for me to base our faith on an event in history that changed everything. I'm going to ask our band to come back up. They'll get a sense of what my justice smells like. Come in. It's very fresh. It's very fresh. It's Lysol. And here's what I'm going to invite us to do. We sang a song this morning for the first time here called Good Plans. And I don't know how you processed that when you heard it the first time. I can imagine that some of us were like, I don't know if the plans are very good at all, actually. I don't feel like they're good right now. I want to invite you to reconsider your initial response in light of what we've talked about. In light of everything that we just explored together. Is it possible that even when we don't understand, and even when we're uncertain, and even when things don't go the way that we want them to go, even when our sense of justice and good and evil are offended, even then, God's plans are good. He is patient and loving to the point of waiting for us to respond to him. Maybe this is a moment when we want to respond to him. Maybe this is a moment when we want to open our mouths and express ourselves to the one with a good plan.